Okay, folks, I think we can start. It's 1 minute after 12, but I know that other people will join us. Hi, everyone. Great to see you today. Welcome, and thanks for joining us for this webinar on leveraging transit lands for affordable housing. I'm Dina Grazer. I'm director of the Canadian Alliance for Transit Connected Housing, otherwise known as CATCH. And if you're unfamiliar with us, CATCH is a national initiative to preserve and expand affordable housing near transit. We work directly with municipalities, community foundations, housing providers, and others by providing resources like the toolkit that we're going to showcase today. We facilitate collaborations and we co-design blended capital funds to help finance affordable housing near transit. I'm joining you today from Tikaronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. This land is also part of the Dish with One Spoon territory, a treaty between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Anishinaabe, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for this land and its waters. We are grateful for the opportunity to work here and accept our responsibility for honoring this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I'm delighted to have a fantastic panel with us today. In a moment, I'll turn it over to our moderator. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded. Please mute your audio and turn off your video. It will be made available after the fact on our resource center, and we will put a link to that in the chat. If you want to turn on live captions or translated captions, there's a little button, as it says here on the slide, that you can click on the bottom toolbar and a little arrow on the Show Captions button to select your preferred language. I would also ask, let's use the chat. Please tell us who you are and where you're from. Feel free to put questions or comments in the chat as we go, and we'll try to address them as we can. I always think it's fun on webinars when there's a lively conversation that goes on in the chat. So now I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, David Cooper. David is the principal and founder of Leading Mobility Consulting, specializing in the intersection of public transit, housing, and city building. He's led a wide range of transit initiatives across Canada, from feasibility studies to the planning and implementation of rapid transit systems. His recent work emphasizes the relationship between transit investment and housing outcomes, which is one of the reasons that we asked him to moderate here today. We'll put his full, very long bio in the chat so you can read it. And I'm going to turn it over to him now to introduce our panelists and to run the show. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Tina, and it's really great being here with everyone today. And definitely, as a land use planner who works in transit, seeing the marriage of these two conversations is quite important, and definitely has been a priority for many municipalities and the federal government, and definitely a lot of people here on this call today. So, one of the things we're going to do is we have a two-part agenda. The first part is I'm going to turn over to Haban Ali, who has put together the Equitable Transit-Oriented Affordable Housing Toolkit, which she'll, as a resource guide that Catch has put together to help policymakers and individuals in the development space to understand what kind of tools and scenarios and ways that we can move forward on moving forward on affordable housing on transit lands. There's been obviously a lot of conversations on the market side of things, but looking at the affordability piece and how do we actually have the ability to build housing for individuals who may be more reliant on transit to have that close access to transit is vitally important. So I'm going to turn over to Harban to walk us through it. Just a quick bio before we go through the toolkit. She was our primary author of the ETOAH toolkit. She's an independent consultant and trusted advisor with nearly 2 decades of experience leading strategy, planning, and innovation across several sectors. She partners with organizations in Canada and the US to design systems, guide transformation, and bring ambitious ideas at the scale of cities, institutions, and enterprise operations. She's held several really interesting positions, including the Associate Director of Planning Delivery at Sidewalk Labs, and also has been a senior associate at Urban Strategies, a Toronto-based global planning consultancy. So I'll turn it over to Haban, who's going to walk us through a high level of the OAH toolkit.
Thanks, David, and thanks everyone for joining us here today. As David mentioned, my role for today is kind of to walk us through the ETOA toolkit. So what I'll be doing is kind of sharing a live version of the site online here and walking through each of the different sections that we've put together. All right, so kicking off here, we've got the ETOA Practitioners Toolkit. And what we want to do is really just start off by talking about why this toolkit. So last fall, our team at CATCH set out to create a resource to support municipal planners, to support policymakers and housing sort of stakeholders that are really working at the intersection of transit investment and affordable housing. And we know that there are a range of transit lines coming online that are planned or under construction across the nation, and communities are working to ensure these investments can both help improve access and also affordability, while at the same time looking to protect against displacement risks. And so what we wanted to do was contribute to this work overall by creating and establishing a tool here that brings together many of the real world examples of what's happening in the space, some decision-making frameworks, and things that can really help teams that are navigating and working through this work, either independently or working across cross-functional teams, how they might help, how we can create a resource essentially that helps navigate what this might look like. So we spent the fall kind of working with folks, and the winter co-designing. We were sort of consulting and iterating on what could be some best practices and examples, really how to make the toolkit usable for folks working in the space. And we were able to launch this resource this spring. And really what it's meant to do is be a starting point for this work overall. And the goal is to be able to update it over time, add additional resources and materials as the work comes forward. But we hope that in its current form, it really acts as a place for folks to get started in the space if they're looking for new information or how to learn a little bit more about what ETOA practices are as they begin to embark upon that work. And so what we wanted to do up front is really provide a bit of that separation or definitions around more traditional transit-oriented development and ETOA practices, so equitable transit-oriented affordable housing overall. And we know that most people, working in the space are probably quite familiar with transit-oriented development or TOD as a concept. Really the idea of concentrating density and growth around transit nodes to support ridership in many areas. But what ETOA does is sort of expands that and really asks the questions around, what happens to the folks or people living around those corridors. We recognize that rising land values, land speculation, and redevelopment pressures oftentimes can, erode that affordability in those neighborhoods pretty quickly. And so how do you ensure both affordability and displacement prevention are really some important organizing principles upfront when you're doing a lot of that work? And I would say that ETOA as a practice also tries to look at the full diversity of communities near transit overall. So, thinking about urban indigenous populations, around seniors, new immigrants, racialized communities, who are a lot of the times the groups most impacted by transit-induced displacement, and sometimes are not often served by some of the conventional TOD practices. So what the upfront section does is kind of walk you through why we created the toolkit and some helpful definitions that separate TOD from ETOA concepts overall. So what I want to do is kind of walk you through the other components of the ETOA site overall. And so what we see here is that it starts off with a bit of a knowledge assessment. A knowledge assessment comes right after the overall introduction. And what it's meant to do is sort of test your knowledge of ETOA practices. It sets out to introduce sort of 10 self-guided questions as a part of the quiz here. And it takes you from some of the foundational ETOA practices, similar to kind of the concept definitions, all the way into more nuanced sort of real-world examples of what's happening within this sort of subject area. Each question then kind of gives you some immediate feedback. So as you're answering a question, you get feedback on sort of the context of what that looks like that are based on some ETOA research that we've developed as well. So we designed it so that, an individual or a planning team that wants to know more about ETOA practices can sort of run through the quiz, starting off with some of those more foundational questions and arriving at more complex sort of scenario-based questions as well. So what it does is provides a bit of a baseline for anybody that's sort of entering the space and working together with teams to have a baseline understanding of what it looks like. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that quiz or taking it yourself, you just have to click on the Take the Quiz button and you can run through it. It's pretty quick to kind of go through. As we then sort of scroll through, you get to the policy levers. Now, the policy levers are really the heart of the toolkit itself. There's 6 of them in total, and they were identified through some of the research and consultations that we were having with planning and other practitioners. Now, we don't believe that they represent all of the levers that are used for ETOA overall, but they're really a good place to start to learn more about what might be some options for folks working in the space. Now, if you click on each one of the sort of square boxes that are here, they'll open up into a standalone PDF. Each of them is readable in about 5 or 6 minutes. And what they intend to do is cover what's in the lever itself, sort of how it works, some equity considerations that are embedded into it, success factors to sort of make it implementable over time. And it gives you a real world case study of how that lever may be used in a particular municipality. So one of the important things to note as you're going through the levers is they're definitely not a one size fits all. Each of the lever works in a particular context. We recognize that based on the municipality that you may be working in or you may be connected to, there are different mandates, different relationships with different transit authorities. So it may be different depending on where you are. But this really helps provide some foundational context around how some of these levers may be used and could be adapted and amended to serve your particular purpose. Now, as you know, in today's session, we'll be walking through the third one as part of our discussion with the panelists, the Joint Development on Transit Agency Lands. So I'll go through that one a little more detail to help us build some of the context for today's discussion. So walk you through some of the other areas here that are on the site. The next section is the learning modules. And these are meant to be sort of facilitated activities that you can do either individually or more commonly as a part of a group. What they intend to do is kind of walk you through some shared principles. Just a reminder, if you aren't already on mute, just a reminder to make sure your mute button is hit here so we can go through the session. So again, the learning modules here have 2 facilitated activities, primarily designed for teams, but you can run through some of them independently just to get a context of the questions here. And the first one, what it's meant to do is provide some shared working definitions for both affordability and equity. So, as first blush, they may seem like, pretty standard or basic concepts, but when you start to go through them with a group and understand what they may mean in different cross-functional sort of conditions, you start to sort of arrive at how they may be applied differently in different settings. So it's a great way of arriving at some shared definitions before you're launching a project. The second one is a bit of a role-playing simulation where participants are able to navigate sort of competing institutional mandates in a real ETOA context. So again, it helps you run through what are the different priorities for each cross-functional team and how that may impact sort of working together to implement an ETOA project overall. Both can be done in about 60 minutes, and again, would be great to do with teams who are embarking on some shared work together. And then the last piece here is the resource library. Again, this is meant to be sort of a curated space, a set of research, policy documents across these various different categories, everything from data and metrics to some training videos, and again, some additional case studies and policy lever examples to help support some of the additional work overall. So that's the sort of context of what's in the site overall. It gives you a bit of the overall structuring. And again, I encourage folks to sort of click on the link and run through it independently. I did then want to spend just a couple minutes more talking more about the policy lever related to joint development on transit agency lands. And again, as you click through this particular tab here, what it does open up is that PDF that I mentioned. And this gives you the overview of what that particular lever represents. Again, it walks through what it is, the equity impacts, how it works, and it spotlights a particular case study example. So for this one, we know that at its core, joint development is sort of a real estate and a policy strategy. And this one in particular is an opportunity where a transit agency, so Metrolinx, TransLink, Calgary Transit Authority, partners with a public, private, or nonprofit developer to build housing or mixed-use development project on lands that the transit agency either already owns or is in control of. And that includes things like the actual station site itself. It can include station yards and parking lots, and in some cases even sort of just the air rights above a transit infrastructure. And so what we're seeing in this particular case, the mechanism that's often used to support the sort of development agreement is a long-term ground lease. So what the transit agency is able to do is, it continues to retain ownership of the land. It's, contributes it at sort of a below market cost. And in exchange for doing that, you're able to embed affordability requirements directly into a development agreement. So For us, when we're thinking about the 6 levers, why was this one in particular, called out as lever? This was interesting to look at because, transit agencies in some cases can have really strategically valuable land in a city. And that land in some cases also already, it's obviously publicly owned, but it's adjacent to transit. So what can happen in that particular scenario, in the absence of not having a joint development policy, that land can then be monetized without any affordability built in. And in some cases, it can be totally sold outright, and you sort of lose the leverage of that land and the ability to sort of create ETO practices in that particular sort of location. So what we see in this particular one, when we tried to call out, what's a particular example of how this is being used, we have the example of the Los Angeles County Transit Authority, Metro, and they have a joint development program in support of these types of practices overall. And so when we look at the outcomes or the success factors of this particular example, we see that what Metro was able to do is that, they set out a particular target of 10,000 homes on Metro-owned land by 2031 to become affordable. So essentially half of those, something around like 5,000 units, have to actually be reserved for folks under a specific income threshold as a part of that development agreement. And so in this case, their baseline is about 35% of houses reserved for homes earning at or below 60% of the area median income. And so when we look at a city like LA, that's a pretty significant contribution for these particular lands. And through that joint development agreement, what they're also able to do is push the developers to go even deeper beyond that threshold to create more units at better affordable rates for a longer time period as well. So again, the mechanism that they're using here is the ability to sort of structure that ground lease so the affordability requirements don't expire on that land, and you're able to sort of provide the developer with a discounted lease rate to make the project financially feasible on their end. So again, we're using an American example in this case, but some of the applications of what being used here certainly could be applied to different Canadian examples. And what's interesting about today's discussion is that we have a number of the panelists here who can speak to what that might look like in the Canadian context or how it might be used in our context today already. So the last thing I just wanted to call out as a part of the toolkit itself is just the last section on kind of what happens next year. As I mentioned up front, this is sort of a starting point for this work, the creation of pulling together each of these different resources and organizing it into a framework that's hopefully helpful for folks who are starting to embark on this work. It's meant to be intentionally sort of a live, iterative document. So again, as new resources become available, we're able to sort of update the site to help folks who are working in this space, and recognize that there's some additional pieces that we'll want to include over time to make sure it's as fulsome as possible. So if you are interested in learning more about the toolkit itself, or learning more about how you may be supported in your own work through some of the work that Catch does overall, feel free to reach out to the team and the websites that's sort of listed here, and we'll be able to continue the conversation from there. So that gives you hopefully a bit of an overview on the site and today's conversation. I'll stop sharing my screen here and turn it back over to David.
Thanks, Havan. One of the things just to also note for all the panelists and our attendees today is that the toolkit's also available in French, so it's a bilingual guide. I've gone through it and gone through some of the scenarios, so it's very different. Typically when you see toolkits, you see a lot of content and best practices. This one's a bit more dynamic, where you actually do some scenarios and some kind of more group thinking on some of these things and some of the nuances of it. So I deeply appreciate that when I was going through the material. I'm going to switch gears now. So for the next remaining part of the webinar, we're going to have a bit of a cross-functional conversation with a number of different individuals and with differing roles on the intersection of affordable housing on transit. I'm quite excited to have this cross-functional conversation because there's a lot of people in the tent that we need to work with to make this happen on sites across Canada. We have 3 panelists here. One's representing major municipal government, the second a transit agency, and the third is a private developer that is delivering affordable housing on a transit site. So I'm really excited to be joined by the 3 of them. So we have Stuart Kehrig, who's the director of the Housing Action Team from the City of Edmonton. Stuart is experienced project manager with extensive experience in non-market housing sector. For the last 3 years, he's helped oversee the implementation of more than $200 million in the Federal Housing Accelerator Fund, largely focused on increasing affordable housing, multifamily housing, and transit development. We have Michael Stevenson from the Toronto Transit Commission, where he serves as the head of property planning and development within the engineering, construction, and expansion group of the TTC, where he supports capital projects, facility and real estate optimization, third-party expansion, asset integration, and city building initiatives. And then lastly, we have Martina Jileckova, the CEO of Onward Homes. Martina's passionate about Onward's vision with homes for all people and having communities thrive. She comes to the role with 20 years of experience in the real estate sector with a strong record of transformational growth, operations, and partnerships. She's led the development of more than 1,000 housing units in the non-market sector. And what's really exciting to me as part of the conversation is that she is managing the implementation of affordable housing on a transit park and ride site in Calgary. So living through the transformation of that site into building affordable housing right on a transit asset. So the way I'm going to structure the conversation is everyone has a very unique role, but intersects with each other in a lot of ways. And the first question I have is for Stuart. So really looking at the conversation of the relationship of the municipal government when it comes to really setting the policy table, when it comes to setting the direction of how we want to build, transit and housing. It's something that's very obvious to a lot of people, but how do we set those policy parameters and getting council direction to do this is quite vital and necessary as part of this conversation. So Stuart, maybe if you want to walk us through, what role municipalities play in creating these conditions to facilitate the joint development on transit lands to succeed from, I would say, both a market and non-market perspective, but obviously focusing a little bit more on non-market in your answer.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm actually going to start with a little bit of maybe a plug to say the toolkit is actually a really good thing that we have used ourselves to help us both validate that we're on the right path and also come up with other ideas about maybe what we should be doing. And so from a municipal perspective, I think it's also important to ground yourself back within your larger legislative perspective that your province would have, as well as the federal government, because we are, unfortunately, the lowest on the federalism kind of levers there. And so we also have to consider, what's feasible within our provincial regulations. So when we look at it as, we in Edmonton don't actually build affordable housing. We help other groups put forward affordable housing and other types of housing. And so when we look at these transit opportunities, there's different things that are within our control. And I say that within our control, but also underneath our Provincial Municipal Government Act. And so some of those things are zoning. So what is the zoning that can be conducive to seeing the type of development that we want around transit? And typically that's higher density. That's also different elements, though, of design about, coordination back to a development site and how they integrate together. And so through our zoning bylaw, that is usually the way that we can help regulate that. We, in the past, though, and this was one of our Housing Accelerator Fund actions, is that we looked at, some of the zoning that we had presently around some of the sites where we wanted to see higher density and where transit was. And we made the conscious decision that we were going to upzone that on our own to help bring that future opportunity. And so that is also like a further kind of lever that can be used on top of the actual zone itself, is the city can take an active role in how that zone would be set around those areas. And then, to be frank, it's land assembly oftentimes. And that land assembly really comes back to that initial creation of that transit asset. And so in Edmonton, we have light rail transit and we also have bus rapid transit that I would say are true mass transit, as opposed to just our regular transit lines, which are different places throughout the city. So that can be a challenge, though, on that land, on finding the land, purchasing the land, because of also some of the different agreements that flow through from the federal government and the provincial government about where your funds can be administered for the purchasing of lands for those transit assets. Because it's very much about the transit asset. It's not about the housing assets that would be combined with the transit. And sometimes people will think, okay, you got that, you had to buy this large piece of land, and now you carved out a sliver of that to put a train through or put a train line through. You got this remnant parcel. That's an obvious housing site. And in a way, it might be, but within the federal and provincial contracts, there's also different stipulations about what the expectations are for selling land afterwards and whether or not those can be sold at a market value and what those market values would then translate back to the other levels of government to help pay off the asset purchase, or the complications of potentially selling that below market value where you would not see any uplift to pay back those different other levels of government for their support. So there's a lot of complexity around how a city can work towards building that housing. And one of the big things that people often will talk about is, well, what about setting inclusionary zoning on these different sites to help ensure that affordable housing will occur in a redevelopment? And that's where, again, I say it's very important to consider the legislative pieces that come from the province. In Alberta, technically, we're not allowed to do inclusionary zoning. And so we don't have that capacity as a municipality to put that in at the end of line to say, thou must have 20% affordable housing through the zoning if you want to do a development. We don't have that power. I would say we have more allowances to do carrots as opposed to sticks. So whether it's grants or sale below market value.
Stuart, yeah, thanks for walking us through that. And there's definitely the intersection and complexity of what the province can and cannot allow you to do, and definitely has been quite nuanced across the country, which also makes it very complicated from establishing obviously federal funding opportunities when we look at integrating transit and housing. And then there's always the fluidity of how this works out after you also get corresponding council votes and other plans and processes underway. I'm going to turn over the next question to Michael. When we did the Canadian Urban Transit Association Housing is on the Line report, one of the recommendations we had was getting transit agencies more involved in this conversation about building more housing on transit. And one of the things that was very illuminating as part of that conversation is the governance and role the agencies see themselves in is very different across the country. So, we have TransLink in Vancouver that is now having active roles in developing their sites for revenue generation for transit capital. We've had a long history of the TTC doing integrated development opportunities along existing stations. We've also had, I'll speak from my time at Calgary Transit, the city it's a department of the city. So obviously they have to loop in and integrate with how the city does its stewardship and real estate processes. So where as a transit agency is functions as a organization to move people, where do you see yourself as an organization today in terms of having an active role in these conversations with transit housing, and where do you see that relationship going from the perspective of the transit authority?
Yeah, thanks, David. It is an evolution story, really. Transit in Toronto is quite historical, as most people know. It dates back to the mid 1840s and has evolved from multiple transit providers to this one multimodal, integrated, third largest transit provider in North America. So that context is that we have a lot of history, and we have a lot of history of development, as you noted, over top of connecting to adjacent to transit, and that's existed since the subway was constructed into the 60s, 70s, and we've seen that also evolve to more complex developments. We've seen a significant increase in residential development over top and connecting into the higher order transit, because developers see the benefit of that. They see a benefit of, you can have a mixed use development that connects into a transit system or has proximity to a transit system, and you can have these complete communities in and around the higher order transit system. So it definitely our role has evolved, and I would say our role has evolved even significantly over the last I want to say close to 20 years now because of a few things. The way that the TTC is set up, TTC since Metro Toronto was established in 1955 has not purchased any land. So pre Metro Toronto, everything was purchased in TTC's name. Since that, all the facilities have been purchased in the City of Toronto's name. So we actually have the ability to transfer property to our development arm, Creatio, which was formerly Build Toronto. And we've been doing that process for a number of years, and which has resulted in either planned, construct, or under construction, constructed or under construction housing units of over 10,000 units through that process. So some of those significant developments have included that are under construction right now. 777 Victoria Park Avenue, it's 705 units, and 256 of those are affordable. That's the Victoria Park subway station here in the East End of Toronto. As you may or may not know, it underwent a massive capital construction to improve that station with the future goal of having that development. So we took an old station, ensured that it was constructed and developed to facilitate that development. 50 Wilson Heights is one of our former commuter parking lots. It's over 1,400 units with 519 affordable. And then another notable one is 2444 Eglinton, also another former commuter parking lot with 612 units and 100% affordable. So what we see, really the evolution is that we've become a partner in these developments, and partner insofar as there's a mutual understanding of what our transit requirements are, what we need the lands for, and we work very closely with these development agencies and partners and developers to make these developments successful.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting because there's definitely a mix of types of units and things like that. Maybe just to add on to that question with Creatio, with those sites, like is Creatio advancing those more so from the city's policy objectives of building more housing on transit? Is any of those funds from those development opportunities being reinvested back to the TTC? Because that's one of the debates I hear from transit agencies saying, we have an interest because obviously we want to spur ridership growth. We want to help advance some of these policy objectives of building housing, but also they really want the capital to offset, obviously, these pretty significant capital plans. Like, where is that, I guess, that relationship?
Yeah, there's the majority of the goal is obviously city building, right? We're talking it's a package. It's not one or another. So you have to look at everything in totality. In some situations, there's capital components that may be constructed as part of a development, and so we can achieve that through the development. But the TTC isn't set up in a way where we benefit monetarily from those developments. So the land is used for a purpose for a period of time, commuter parking lot or some sort of station. Then it goes over to the City of Toronto's development arm, Creatio, where they essentially do the deal. And it's a whole package. Does that answer your question, David?
Yeah, no, that totally answered the question. I'm going to turn over to Martina. You're in a unique position of working on a site that is delivering affordable housing on a transit site, which is a first in the city that you're doing that in Calgary to that extent. Maybe from your perspective, what lured you to that site and really working within those parameters to develop affordable housing at a transit site?
Thank you, David. And thank you for including us. Really appreciate to be part of this great group. Very helpful to to listen to the toolkit and an excellent presentation. Really appreciate Habon's comments. And it's also great to have both city Edmonton, mind you, but representation as well as the transit people, because we are exactly at that intersection of all of it. And so what attracted us to the site is, I'm going to pick up on actually Michael's comment. It's that whole concept of city building, right? So we are onward, and I want to keep that thought, okay? Because it's really, I think, critical to what we do on that site. It's about city building, and from that, whole bunch of things follow, right? So Onward is an affordable housing developer, asset, and property manager, right? So it's in our purpose, which you read, David, to not just own, but also to develop housing. So to add to the affordable housing supply. And just very briefly, all housing is good. All housing is good on transit lands. There's a bit of a difference between housing, the mixed use, the housing that we talked about, the two previous panelists mentioned, and affordable housing. There's a difference. And the difference is not in quality. The difference is not about location. The difference is about the rents that we offer to some of the most vulnerable Calgarians in our context, but the same will be true for Toronto, right? So our site of 400 units will have mixed income groups living with us, some very deeply subsidized rents, and this is an important concept to keep in mind. So some of our residents will pay 50% of the market rents or even below, and some of our residents will be 10-20% below market, so still mixed income, but on that scale. And why that's important is because we love the land, because the land is near transit, which is exactly what our residents need. Our residents are recent immigrants. Our residents are people living with permanent disabilities, be it developmental disabilities, mental health challenges, but they earn $2,000 a month. And if rent is $1,500, we all know there's a gap, right? So the mixture of residents, so to be transit is super important to us. Where we come, at a bit of that's the whole intersection, we start getting into competing interests, right? So what drew us to the site is the ability to develop near transit, because our residents don't drive. And I loved what both, Stuart and Michael said about, well, it's more than just about getting money out of this development. It's about the city building. And when we provide affordable housing near these sites at discounted rate, we don't always offer that return on investment that you can capture in property taxes or through market land sale. We offer that return on investment in that city building, spirit. We have now some of the most vulnerable Calgarians, not on the streets, not in the shelter, but living in near transit hubs and able to get to employment opportunities, to social services very, very easily. So that's what drew us to that site. It's also the scale. We are able to develop 400 units or just shy of 400 units in one location and have that true mixed income model.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think walking through, who benefits and who will live in those near development, I think is actually quite important. I'm going to pull Haban back to the conversation. Hearing kind of the differing roles that everyone has on this panel here, how does this lace itself and integrate into the work of the toolkit, and how could individuals here on the webinar kind of build from the commentary that we just heard and then part of the toolkit? And before you answer that, I'll also say the attendees, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to try to grab a couple of those for the panelists. But Haban, if you want to maybe tell us how you want to integrate that and how people can build upon that with the toolkit, that'd be great.
Yeah, I say, part of why we wanted to make sure that we integrated the two learning modules is to really help do some of this kind of scenario sort of planning. I think with some of the particular projects that were mentioned here, you're sort of seeing the scale at which various different departments are involved in transit-related work and housing integration work. And so one of the modules that's there really looks at what is the type of cross collaboration that might be needed across teams to deliver these types of projects over time. And each department essentially is bringing their own individual mandates, their individual priorities and interests to a project, and how do you actually come to sort of a common baseline around what we're trying to achieve together, and how we might be able to do that sort of collectively, to really support what Martina was talking about around coming back to that city building spirit and really helping to support the underserved communities. So I think if you go through that learning module, you can start to see how challenging sometimes it can become when you're sitting at the table with lots of different folks, again, with different priorities and mandates. And so how do you really step into the shoes of those who may not be working from your particular lens, if that's housing or if that's transit or if that's economic development, to be able to understand how to work more collectively to achieve our collective desired goals around this. So I'd again encourage folks to kind of work with their teams around that simulation exercise that's there, which goes through an ETOA type project, and look at how challenging that might become, and what it might be needed upfront when you're starting to establish these projects to develop that institutional baseline around not only how you're going to work together, but how to overcome some of those individual priorities and mandates to achieve shared collective goals that are really city building goals.
Thank you for that, Haman. A question I want to ask all the panelists, and if one of the panelists says something, another panelist wants to comment on, definitely open to having that live commentary, is, if you had a magic wand, if there was one thing that could really help you from your perspective or one of your partners, from, let's say, government or private development could do to help accelerate this. I think one of the things, I've worked in planning for 20 years, both in the municipal, regional, and private sector side, is, planners love process, and process takes time. And one of the things that has been kind of eye-opening to me on this equation is that even when things are city planning or city building objectives, we don't do a really good job, I find, of like accelerating the process or simplifying things or strengthening the partnerships at times. So, from everyone's perspective, if there was one thing that could help accelerate, so we have a whole portfolio of these kind of examples across the country with differing types of organizations and locations across the country, what would it take to actually make this happen even faster? I think there's a hunger from the federal government to make things occur faster. The public's patience wants things faster. You can't have a crisis without acting faster. So, what's going to make it faster? What do you need to make this actually happen faster?
Do you want us to just jump in, or
just jump right in? Yeah,
or
Martina, I could see
I
you.
wasn't
Yeah,
sure
yeah.
I wasn't sure
Martina,
the
go for it.
instructions were.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll start because we are building, right? And so we have a site, and we are at the beginning of that building because we are still putting together the approvals and the funding for the project. What we need, and I think anybody needs, generally speaking, is commitment to leadership. And I know it's like, okay, well, what do you mean by that? It's just a word. But what we mean by that in this context is, look, we described the challenges, David, and you just touched on them, and the previous panelists touched on them as well. The challenges are, we have our priorities. We have different departments within the city, and they have different priorities. We have provincial and federal level priorities, right? And so we talk about these systems and these policies as though there are some things that are over here, and oh my gosh, what are we going to do with them? And when I think about it, we create these systems, we create these policies. They are not external threats that we cannot control. What's an example of external threat? It's a tariff. Some country imposes tariff on Canada. We can then negotiate with that country, but not. But it's external threat we cannot do much about because somebody else decided, I'm going to do this, okay? But these challenges that we talk about in the context of developing housing and affordable housing on lands adjacent to transit, they're not external threats. They're internal weaknesses. And the beauty of internal weaknesses is that we can do something about them. So if the city of Edmonton or city of Calgary, city of Toronto says it's important to us that we house vulnerable Calgarians near transit because of all the good reasons that we can go through, then the leadership that I'm talking about is making that goal happen. And another cliche, throw in leadership. What does that mean? I'm going to throw another one, breaking the silos. Okay, transit. So, you have some policy somewhere that says, if I sell the site, I have to generate revenue for transit. There's some other policy, maybe with the real estate department of the city of Calgary or any city. Hey, when I sell land, I get market value. Okay, well, those are policies. Somebody put them in place. So the leadership that we are, describing here, and so many examples, we could spend the next, 2 hours as opposed to 30 minutes, keep talking about it. Those are policies that we created. So then let's not, as you say, there's this toolkit, like how do we work together? Well, how we work together is, what is the shared goal? If the shared goal is to take a parking lot that has nothing on it and develop into housing, that strike that policy that says that I must generate income, strike that policy that says that, I need to sell the land at profit. And that's that. So these policies and systems that we put in place, they're not imposed on us. We created them.
I'm going to jump in on that, Martina. And
if you're going to have a debate,
I don't
that's
disagree
gonna
with
be good.
anything you said, but what the challenge is a lot of these are in contractual obligations. It's not a policy. And from a municipal perspective, we absolutely, would like to have that ability to, take these lands and move them here. Challenge is we have to not only, it's not a policy, it's a contractual obligation with multiple levels of government. And at the time, also with P3 procurement. And so some of these contractual obligations are, I'll be blunt, are what's getting in the way of us being able to activate new land to move this. And so I do think, kind of picking up on a statement, and maybe I'll run with it a little bit, affordable housing doesn't get built without political will. You need to have political will to say this is a priority, and we will move or change policies, or we will amend a contract to do that. But it's political will across all levels of government is really where it has to come. And right now we have a federal government that's talking a lot of great things about, the CPTF, the Public Transit Fund, wants to see outcomes that are about housing in its future money that goes out. But they're not applying any money to do the housing. And they haven't really said, and we're going to change these other past rules. It's now setting a new outcome without changing any of the parameters around it. And to be honest, we go, well, we want more housing too, but you can't just will it into existence. And so a lot of that is, I think, putting your flag in sand saying we're doing this, but now it's quite literally retroactively going out, what are all the things that are inhibiting it today? And then going forward to see what we can change. And then having actual capital to make it happen.
I will just jump in, David. Stuart, I think you and I are saying the same thing. And I talk about policy and it can be changed. So can agreements. Believe me, somebody who's operated affordable housing, Onward has been around we are celebrating our 50th anniversary. And there's all kinds of agreements we have from 40 years ago that no longer make sense. You do the same with them as with the policy. You open the conversation about changing some clauses of the agreement that no longer make sense. Because the truth is, I cannot envision an agreement that's going to be good for 50 years because I don't know what's going to be in 50 years, right?
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
With you, political bill or just bill of the administration, whether it's transit or whether it's land use or the bill of the administration to make it happen and flag to that's back to the leadership. I cannot make it happen unless you, the chief operating officer for the city, you need to reopen that discussion with the feds and the province. Still comes down to agreements can be changed, policy can be changed. It's that leadership and that focus on that outcome. And I agree with everything you said, by the way.
Yeah, I think we're aligned. Yeah.
I think it's policy and process. I think I get kind of mired down into like how do we accelerate things where I'll give you an example. Like I'll see and I've seen this endless times in my career on both sides of the table where it's like you're approaching a site with city building objectives of building more housing on transit, and then the city treats you like any other applicant. That to me is a massive problem. So, especially when you're trying to achieve the same objectives, but you're spoken to like you're someone else somewhere else. Like, so I think part of it's the process piece and the psychological piece, and having that leadership come down to the working level staff and saying this is a very different relationship. You don't have a partnership when one person treats you the same when you're trying to actually achieve the same thing. That doesn't make any sense. So sorry, this is just my frustration coming out a bit. But Michael, would love to hear your thoughts, and then we have 3 more minutes, so I'll yeah, throw it to Michael, then Herban for a couple of closing thoughts on this.
Very quick, and I agree with Stuart and Martina there, and I also agree with you, David. I mean, process is something that we're challenged with even on our capital side, right? We're, as you said, treated at a higher standard, even though we are the city, we're treated at a higher standard than even the private sector. So yeah, the approvals process sometimes can be onerous and challenging. So that's a process thing. I think what it makes things most successful, as I said earlier, is understanding roles, responsibilities, and requirements clearly, early, and mutually. I think that's a key to making sure these developments happen successfully.
Herban?
Yeah, and I guess the only piece that I could add here is really just sharing a little bit of the frustrations that you expressed, David. When we think about ETOA and ETOA policies, particularly as it relates to getting in front of displacement risk, the timeline in which it takes often to sort of bring an item to council is 18 months to 2 years sometimes. And so the displacement risk is live and active in a community at that time. And so, it takes as long just to bring a conversation up around something that is actively sort of affecting communities. And so to Martina's point, like a part of that is sort of, the policies and the regulatory pieces are there and they're there to be changeable. And so how do we speed up the timeline in which we can sort of expose those opportunities and look to sort of make those amendments and, revisions sooner than later. But at the same time, we recognize that these are, have to be financially appropriate for on the development side as well. So they need to pencil for development, and we recognize that. And so how do you get to the right development agreements that still achieve city building objectives overall and still make it attractive for developers who want to build in this kind of market in different cities as well? So there's certainly a lot to sort of unpack there. But I think that the timeline to which we're able to, have the conversations is really critical either way.
Yeah, I think one thing people don't realize is the how long it takes for things to happen. I was on a Global News morning show live a couple of years ago about talking about TOD on transit on a new LRT line. And I got asked, how long does it take to build things? And I said, from the housing perspective, and the surprise I got from the anchor's face, and I've also said this in meetings, is I said, if nothing goes wrong from planning the site, doing the development permit, getting the financing, constructing the site, I'm like, from the day you submit something to the day someone sleeps in that bed on the first night, you're looking at 5, 6 years. And that's if like everyone answers their emails, you're not chasing people around at City Hall, you don't have a slip up on your financing, you don't have problems with your contractors. When does that ever happen? Right? So like 5, 6 years if nothing goes wrong. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw it back to Dina for some clothing thoughts, and also just to let everyone know where they could find kind of the resources from today's conversation, and to close up some concluding thoughts. So I will turn it over back to Dina.
Thank you so much, David. I have to say, I feel like this conversation was just warming up. I kind of wish we had another half an hour because I could feel everybody starting to get into it. But I want to respect everybody's time and get us out of here by 1. So thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Martina. Thank you, Harbon. Thank you, David. And I also want to say a special thank you to Stephanie Tam, who none of you can see, but who is the wizard behind the screen making all of this happen. Stephanie is going to put a 2-question survey in the chat that we ask you to fill out before you go, just so we have a sense of whether this was hitting the mark. I want to invite you also to keep in touch with us. I should share this, shouldn't I? Hold on here. Here we are. Keep in touch with us. We have a website. It is in both French and in English. Please download the toolkit. Let us know what you think of it. We're very eager to see how people are using it and what they feel like it needs next. Sign up for a newsletter if you haven't already done that. And watch out for us coming to conferences and presentations near you. I'm going to be at the Evergreen Conference next week with colleagues from the Canadian Urban Institute and Waterfront Toronto, talking about transit as a catalyst for unlocking neighborhood potential. Andrea Nempton, our CEO, is going to be a keynote speaker at the Prairies Affordable Housing Summit the week after that. We are also out there doing workshops and meetings with municipalities and community foundations and housing providers. So if you're interested in doing some work with us, please let us know. Thank you all again so much for coming. Thank you all for participating. And I wish all of you a fantastic rest of the day.